was about money, you would not have signed the WCW deal. You would have said, okay, but I owe Vince a phone call.
Right.
And you would have asked for a counteroffer. It wasn't just about the money.
WCW is interested. Are you going to pony up the million? If you pony up the million, yeah.
In your defense, that's the thing. It wasn't about money.
I'll be honest with you. The remark about my kids, it killed it for me. I mean, it was just the nail in the coffin when I just saw how heartless, because he had no idea how much I love my kids.
Yeah.
And when he said that to me, he's thinking, I love the business just as much as he does, and my family comes second. Mm-hmm. That wasn't the case. But, my only option was to call him up and tell him. And this is the part, too, that is just so comical to me, because everybody talks about the success of the WWF when Russo and Ferrara left. Mm-hmm. But my exact words to Vince were, Vince, tomorrow's show is written. We've already written Raw and SmackDown. We're not leaving you high and dry. And my exact words to him were, Vince, you have at least a year to ride this wave. Yep. I said, everything is in place, Vince. You are untouchable.
And the proof of that is when Steve Austin was hot and Nitro was still winning in the ratings. There's nobody who studies, analyzes, or was just a fan of this business who watched both shows, who didn't think Raw was a superior product for about a year, if not longer, before they did what they needed to get people to watch, which was Tyson and the Austin Vince thing that got everyone on the phone saying you got to turn the channel. Mm-hmm. But it was a full year, that Nitro was bad, and it was still winning in the ratings. And that's where, no doubt about it, let's say you only did 10% of the work and not 90% of the creative work. It doesn't matter what percent. The bottom line is when you left, there was a year worth of everybody could have walked away, and those characters in place.
And that was my exact words. Yeah. Because he started the conversation, wanted to be very heated. Yeah. Like the first thing he threw at me was, I'm going to sue you. Yeah. And I'm like, sue me for what? I never had a contract. Yeah. What do you sue me? Yeah. But I was determined. I loved Vince. And I was determined that this conversation isn't going to get ugly here. Mm-hmm. Our last conversation isn't going to get ugly. So, I mean, it took me a while to bring him around and for it to, the reality to sink in. But, the bottom line was, if I had the option to have been able to tell him that in person, I would have been more than happy to. That's one of the reasons why 3 years later I went back. Yeah. Because I wanted to be able to tell him face to face, Vince, this is why I did what I did.
And near the end of your 45-minute conversation with him, you said something like, and who knows, maybe someday our paths will cross again.
No, he said that to me.
He said that to you, okay.
He goes, Vince, I really hope that one day our paths should cross again. Yeah. And you know what? I wanted to leave on a good... I love the guy. I'm not going to sit here and tell you he was this and he was that. I really cared about the guy. Yeah. But, I mean, he and I could speak for Ed on this, he just took everything from us that he possibly could until nothing was left.
And it was like a running joke. Yeah. Every week at TV, when we would be stumbling into the elevators to go up to our rooms at 2 a.m, when we checked in, he would look and say, did I get it all?
Did I
get it all?
Yeah.
Did I get all of it?
Yeah.
And we'd be like,
now, how did
you did.
How did you give your notice? How did that happen? I mean, we know this conversation.
We're flying back from Atlanta. We're stopped over in Philly. It's the first opportunity because they had to rush us to the airport to make our flight so that we would get back. Vince wanted, because Vince had a much longer, much deeper history with Vince than I did. Yeah. So Vince wanted to call him first on his own and just tell him. So what I did was, the first thing the next morning, got in late that night. I made a point to get up early the next morning, and I called Vince. I got him on his cell phone as he was in his car driving to the Meadowlands, and I basically gave him the news, and I said, Vince, it kills me to say this, because I know that you're still reeling, but I'm going with Vince.
And you didn't tell McMahon.
No, he didn't indicate.
But you know what? I really got to say something in Vince's defense here, and I want people to understand this, because I will never in a million years badmouth Vince, because I still really care about the guy. I do. But Vince, he has no idea what he puts a lot of his employees through, because Vince's whole life is the WWF. That's his whole entire life. I have 3 kids. I have a family. Ed has a family. You've got to be willing, in order to be successful and have a job, you've got to be willing to give Vince your life on a silver platter. Mm-hmm. And the bottom line is, we both did that. Mm-hmm. But we both did it until we couldn't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like Vince just, he doesn't know any better, because that's his work ethic.
And so many other people do
him.
that. And
It's
so
worked for
many
him.
people do
Yes.
that.
Yeah, I'll be the first one to say, Vince's car was always the first one there and the last one to leave.
And some people don't understand why Brian Gewirtz gets the attention from Vince that he does and the power, and it's because he is the type of person who fits the mold you're talking about. He's willing to give his life up to Vince McMahon, and when Vince McMahon finds somebody like that, he's going to nurture and protect.
And that's the whole thing too. I mean, I probably started with Vince when I was, early 30s, mid 30s. As you get older and older and older and older, and now you're seeing the family grow up without you there. All of a sudden now, it starts to shift.
Yeah.
And I think Vince just sometimes really has a hard time understanding that, because he can't understand why you wouldn't want to do anything but this.
Yeah.
And it's
it's insight into him. I mean, that's all he knows, and it in some ways it might be the only way he thinks it'll work. He might be so concerned that if he doesn't give it 100% all the time, it'll all be taken away.
Right. There's no room for slack. There's no margin for
because there's too many people who want what he has in his mind.
Right. Exactly.
Now, you guys get to WCW, and I'm sure you have a preconceived notion. You've heard about it to an extent. You've got a preconceived notion. I know interviewing you, your first week on the job, you were very excited about the depth of talent. You said your mouth was watering. You were on the edge. You couldn't wait to work with Goldberg and Sting and Buff Bagwell in the same way that you had Austin and Rock and Mick Foley. You get there. I mean, this can be a very open-ended question, but what surprised you about how different life was in basically the same job? I mean, their nuances are different, but basically same job. You're working for Vince McMahon, now you're working for Bill Bush. Describe how it was different.
Man, that should have been the first question.
Because you can talk for 4 hours on it.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, and before we went in there, we had gotten the heads up. It's a different world down there.
Because there isn't a Vince McMahon leading.
There isn't.
Yeah.
There's no place where the buck stops.
Yeah.
I mean, what you have is with the WWF, you have got a company where the buck stops with Vince McMahon.
Yeah.
He says thumbs up, thumbs down on everything.
Yeah.
And if you have a problem, you go to Vince. If one of the boys doesn't want to do something, they appeal to Vince.
Yeah.
If somebody has an idea, they go to Vince. Here, we've got a oxymoronic, look it up,
big word.
corporate
Is that like a pimple,
wrestling.
Is that a pimple cream?
It could be. It could be. Yeah. You've got a corporate wrestling company.
Yeah.
So because of the corporate nature, because of the ties to TBS, there was always somebody who you could go over somebody's head to appeal to, or somebody could go to somebody else. There was no one place where the buck stopped, and the boys knew this, and they used this to their advantage as frequently as it could. And that, to us, because we came from the culture of the WWF and that locker room and that culture with Vince at the helm and Vince at the head and being the buck stopper, that it just was, at the time, it was kind of inconceivable to us.
And this is a company that flew in 140 wrestlers. I don't know even know if that's exact figure. Maybe it was 80. And they used 20. But they weren't organized enough to save on 60 or 100 plane tickets every single week. Yeah. And it was it was just, well, the money's there, let's spend it, because we don't want to have to plan ahead or think. You mentioned earlier in the interview, you submitted production notes.
Yeah.
And they were like, what's that? I mean, it was that disorganized.
Yeah.
And the thing, too, about it was, the big change for me was, once I became successful in the WWF, I had Vince's protection. Mm-hmm. Nobody touched me. Mm-hmm. If they mess with me, they mess with Vince. Yeah. I mean, that's the way it was, and I had his protection. The first thing I noticed in WCW, and it was the first TV we went to, okay? There was a lot of talking going on behind my back. And everywhere I turned, I saw this and this and this and this. So we got to the point, I'm talking about a month in, where I knew exactly what was going on. But I was getting paid to do a job. I don't get involved in the political games, okay? I was confident in my role and what I could do, and basically my mentality was, you know what? If Bill Bush is naive enough to listen to these guys, then you know what? Send me home and replace me, because I know they can't do half the job I could do if I was allowed to do it. So, I mean, I knew it was going to happen. I mean, the writing was on the walls, but I at no point was going to get involved in that game, because the truth is, Ed and I were interested in trying to turn the company around.
Right.
That's what we were trying to do. And I mean, other people had other agendas, but we tried to stick with the plan of turning that number around.
Now, you talked about how smart Rock was. Steve Austin, very smart to the wrestling business and a smart guy. Mick Foley, probably up there with Rock when it comes to pure intelligence of people you worked with. And Triple H, the Circle Assassin, that's not just a gimmick. You get to WCW, and the talent, they appear to be as big of a stars as Rock and Austin and Foley and Hunter were, because
or
they
potentially.
Well, in a sense, fans perceive them that way because, they were number one in the ratings for a long time.
Right.
Now they're not, but they were, and now it's like all these other reasons that they're not big stars. You get there, and I'm kind of guessing here, but I think you start looking at Sting, whose mind is about 20% on wrestling, 80% other stuff. You get to Bill Goldberg. He just thinks he's the hottest thing ever, and it's he thinks I can do no wrong, but he doesn't understand the business because he didn't do what Steve Austin did for 10 years leading up to it. Buff Bagwell, my gosh, you look at him, you think he's got potential, then you talk to him, and you're like, oh my gosh.
We thought Buff had potential through the roof, because we were pitching at one point to bring him in to WWF, and we were in WWF.
And when you started touting Buff in the interview with me on WCW Live, and people were like, oh, Russo must have been working really hard in the WWF to think Buff has that kind of potential, because people who are following behind the scenes in WCW knew Bagwell was not.
But you know what?
It was 3 years earlier.
You also do not want to go into this thing with preconceived notions.
Right.
And we didn't.
Yes.
When we walked in, everybody was on the same playing field, just like we did at WWF. The difference was there are a lot of people that were a lot more vicious. I mean, they wanted to take you down, and they made no bones about it, and they would lie, they would steal, they would cheat, they would do whatever they had to do to hurt you. And I'm just telling you, that didn't exist at the WWF.
Because there was never a chance Vince McMahon wouldn't be there in 3 years to make you pay the price for something you did today. But with Bill Bush or Eric Bischoff or Jim Herd or Kim Fry,
it was the Wild
whoever,
West.
It was Wild West.
It was completely the Wild West, because again, like I said, there wasn't anybody steering the ship, and you had the guys where we were talking about the intelligence of Rock and Mick and Austin, and their intelligence and getting over their characters. It almost seemed like a lot of the guys in WCW, they used their intelligence to try and play puppet master behind the scenes, and everybody was working everybody else at all times.
And I mean, I think one of the biggest contributors, there's so many reasons, but Goldberg wasn't Austin. He wasn't. It was a mirage. It was a brilliant mirage that was created, but deep down, that substance wasn't there. And you can say, even if the corporate environment, this is my question, is if the corporate environment was perfect and there was a solid leader in place who everybody respected, but he wasn't a wrestling guy, but he was an iron fist. He said, you are the boss and you will be for 2 years, and everyone respected that. Do you think you still would have been a success? And let's say standards and practices didn't exist. Do you still think you could have recreated with Goldberg and Sting and Bret what you had with Rock and Foley and Austin? Because I think they're...
I'm telling you, man, I was very... Ed and I worked there for 3 months.
Yeah.
The last show before we started, I remember, the rating was a 2.6. After 3 months, we were at a 3.4. I was very, very satisfied with us getting the pieces in place.
Yeah.
I really felt that we were. I was happy with the job we were doing despite it all. Guys that never got airplay before were on TV. We were doing cool things with Ernest Miller and Billy Kidman and Norman Smiley. And the list goes on and on and on and on.
If we had been given the 2 years...
a year.
Yeah. Let alone 3 months before the meddling started.
Right.
You guys are 8 weeks in, and that's when there started to be a sense of a political movement internally against you. You had J.J. Dillon, Kevin Sullivan, some of the wrestlers. They're thinking, hey, we think we're better off with somebody else than you two guys. This is what you had to stand on. This is where you could point to numbers and say, previous 8 weeks, the 2 hours of Nitro was a 3-hour show. The 2 hours of Nitro that went head-to-head with Raw. That's what was the meat of the whole debate. Previous 8 weeks before you guys arrived, 2.7 average rating. Let's take in a big scope. 2 whole months before that. The 8 weeks you were around, the average was 3.0. Previous 8 weeks, next 8 weeks. you increased 0.3 of a rating point the head-to-head 2 hours.
On the average.
On average, and there were peaks and valleys in there. It wasn't just a trend up. It wasn't just a trend down. There was curiosity at first. The first couple weeks were a little above that. Then Raw, in the meantime, and this is where the evidence was clear. You took viewers away from Raw with what you were doing. Raw, the previous 8 weeks before you arrived, was 6.2. The 8 weeks after you two took over, 5.8. So basically, a 3 or 4 tenths of a point difference switched from Raw to Nitro. There's no debating that topic during those 2 hours, a 0.3 to 0.4 over a 2-month period. Yet, during that time, your critics knew that there was an advantage. And you had said up front, I don't even expect to see a ratings change for months.
Yeah.
And yet there was a ratings change. But this is a criticism of you. Absolutely, positively, the number one criticism of you guys was you're too worried about making a difference in the ratings and you're not promoting the pay-per-view. You're giving away too much on TV too quickly. The pace isn't there, and you're giving all these matches away and all this stuff, and it's so much is going on. There isn't that feeling of Starrcade's coming up and it's going to be the biggest match ever. And I know that was the argument the critics used against you. How do you react to that? Did you feel a pressure to deliver right away with the ratings, or did you not even feel you were taking that approach?
Let me start, and then because I know you've got a lot to say on this too. One of the things was just from my perspective, but I think I can speak for Vince on this. It wasn't so much about we were giving away too many free matches on free TV, that we should be holding back for the pay-per-view, and that we should be building towards Starrcade. We were building towards Starrcade. What we were doing was we were trying to reinvent the company at the time.
Yeah.
We were trying to establish that this wasn't your daddy's WCW. This wasn't your grandfather's WCW. This wasn't the WCW that you were watching last week.
Yeah.
This is a new day, a new beginning. And it took time to do that. And one of the things we had to do in the beginning, if you're going to clear up the table and start from scratch, which is what we were doing theoretically, we wanted to start off. That's why we did that huge tournament. What was it, 32 men? 32 wrestler tournament, or 16, I think it was 32, to come up with that main event for Starrcade. And in the course of pursuing that tournament, we gave away a lot of great matches on free TV. But you know what? Also, we had 3 hours to fill. This was before we were able to knock that hour off of Nitro.
Yep.
And it just, in terms of the pace at which that we were used to writing TV, the paces of the shows, and how much we would put in a show, there physically were not enough hours in the day to do the show that we wanted to do and fill 3 hours.
Yeah.
So, we wanted to reinvent the product. We wanted to change people's way of perceiving WCW, and we were building toward Starrcade. From day one, we were building toward that new NWO that basically I think could have really taken off if it hadn't been for all the other political things that were against us.
3 bullet points. You say you want to reinvent, you want to change how people see it. What is that? How are you changing it? What's different?
Giving guys a shot that had been previously taken for granted and not given shots to, not given attention.
So one thing
TV
fans
time.
are going to notice watching your first 8 to 12 weeks is different wrestlers are getting a push than used to.
Correct.
What's another?
Giving them an opportunity to take the ball and run with it. Another thing we were doing was changing the tone of the program, because we watched the Nitro the night after we got hired. We got together that Monday night and watched Nitro at Vince's house. And we were just shaking our heads. And I remember at one point we turned to each other and said something to the effect of, "Oh, isn't that adorable? They're trying to do a pre-tape."
Mm-hmm.
And as cocky as that sounds, because it was horrible. Because these stories that they were telling behind the scenes, they weren't stories.
Yeah.
There was nothing happening. Nothing was actually happening. It was just shots backstage, stuff going on, but nothing happened to move stories along.
Yeah.
And we needed to change people's way of thinking. We need to show the audience that, no, there is stuff going on. It's not just about what is in the ring. We needed to get the audience used to seeing the stuff that we were producing backstage and the stories that we were sparking backstage and how they would eventually pay off.
So
in the ring.
pre-producing was maybe a one-word way of one of the major changes. You wanted it more pre-produced and less throw a match out there and film it.
Well, it was more complex and more in-depth storytelling.
Okay.
And the pre-producing went hand in hand with that. So.
Well, it's 2 things. My philosophy was every week you write the best show you can.
Yeah.
Every week.
But some people say, no, you should be thinking 3-4 months ahead.
But you know what? The way we wrote Nitro was no different than the way we were writing Raw.
Okay.
We knew what we were heading
We
toward.
changed nothing in the formula. And number two, it's something that you said, Wade. It's when things started changing at the WWF, the ratings took a while to change.
Yeah.
But the difference was Vince accepted that. Vince knew that. Vince knew these ratings weren't going to change overnight. WCW wanted the ratings to change tomorrow. They put that pressure on us from day one. And I used to say to them, guys, it doesn't work that way. And I even used to show them graphs from the WWF. This is how long it took to get to a 3. This is what we did to get to a 4. But they literally wanted to go from a 2 to a 4 in a month.
Yeah.
And realistically, that's impossible for
And plus all the
any
roadblocks
show.
that they were throwing in our way.
Right,
I mean, if you want to look at it as we were the world jumping jack champions.
Yeah.
And they signed us because they wanted us to do jumping jacks on their TV. And then they put handcuffs and manacles on us and said, "Why aren't you doing good jumping jacks?"
Well, what's a money angle? Not a 30-second comedy side bit or something that would have been fun, and you disagree that it didn't make the air. But what's something that was money that they said no to that really hampered your style? Because I mean, I understand frustration if you wanted to do something kind of risque, but was that really enough to just slow down the big picture, which is we need to get these two guys over and make people pay to see them fight?
Well, bro, you got to understand at the time, what you got to ask yourself, was there any real big money angles? Because the reality was they were so deep in a hole that it was like nobody was over anymore.
Right.
I mean, literally,
No, you're right.
and that's why one of the things Ed and I had to do was get some of these guys over again.
Or get them
I
back
mean,
over.
You talked earlier about Bret Hart. I mean, look what they did to this guy.
Yeah.
I mean, the NWO, Hall and Nash, they ran that thing into the ground. So the reality of it is when we took over, there really was no money to be made. What we were trying to do, our big thing was that NWO angle and the different faces, and Bret being a big part of that.
Yeah.
And then what happened to us that really hurt was when Bret got hurt. This is something we planned for 3 months.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, Bret's hurt, and it's almost like you're right back where you started, But,
And 2 days before the pay-per-view, we find this out. We
Right.
found it out on a Thursday.
Now, you're about 8-10 weeks in, there's political forces working against you. Kevin Sullivan. I mean, you clearly did not have the confidence and the authority behind you to feel that you were on solid ground. But when word came in January that you're out, did that just blow you away, or did you kind of see it coming, or how did you react to the news when they said, "Oh, we gave you 3 months"? That's
well,
enough.
it really didn't work that way. I mean, it's so funny because so much was going on behind the scenes politically, and we were at my house. We were writing the television. I'll never forget, I think Ed was there and Terry Taylor was there. When Ed and Terry Taylor left, I called my attorney and I said, "I don't care what you have to do, you've got to get me out of this deal." I said, I'll leave every penny on the table. You've got to get me out of this, That same day, I supposedly was supposed to go to the office to have a meeting with Hogan and Flair. So I just have that conversation with my attorney, okay? And I go to the office, and of course there's no Hogan, there's no Flair, there's Bill Bush, okay? So Bill Bush sits behind his desk, and Bill Bush was like...
He wasn't the most imposing figure.
But he was also the nicest guy in the world.
Such a sweet guy.
Nicest guy in the world, and so I knew he was white as a ghost. So I knew he's dropping some kind of a bomb here.
Yeah.
So, he sits down and he says to me, almost shaken, very scared.
Yeah.
Vince, we've decided to take a change in direction here, and we want you to be part of a committee. Now you've got to understand, I just got off the phone with my lawyer saying, you got to get me out of this.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'm thinking of is, these guys are breaching my contract.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't have been any more luckier. So I kind of looked Bill in the eye and I said, "Bill," I said, "with all due respect, I said, I didn't get hired to be part of a committee.
Yeah.
I said, I'm not interested in that. I said, you do what you got to do. I understand. I'm not interested in being part of a committee. I said, so I'm going to go home now, and you call me and tell me what you're going to do about my contract."
Yeah.
I mean, and that was it. Because,
And the committee was happy to have you gone because they wanted to prove they could do it.
Absolutely, and they did. I mean, for the next, I guess the next 3 months. Yeah.
And it was, and the next 3 months were very rough. And in their defense, they had almost nobody to work with. I mean, Nash was gone,
Absolutely.
Goldberg was gone, Bret Hart was gone. They had to go with the Wall, Sid, and Jeff Jarrett.
And the guy and that dog character.
The dog, yeah.
What was his name?
Al Green.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
dog.
they had nothing to work with, but at the same time, there weren't signs that they were doing much with what they had either. It was just
Right.
WCW was in shambles. They were
Right.
worried about the money loss at that point because for so long,
Right.
Eric Bischoff didn't have to worry about the bottom line.
But
And all of a
also-
sudden, tens of millions of dollars of losses are coming up, and improving the ratings 3/10 didn't matter anymore to the higher ups.
Right.
What mattered was, are we making money on pay-per-view? But how do you make money on pay-per-view when the product was in shambles and no wrestlers were over?
Plus,
It was
also,
a no-win
as
situation.
far as that money issue goes, we want to talk about the lag.
Yeah.
What a lot of what it was is all of these deals that had been brokered when WCW was at its peak
Yeah.
they were still in effect.
Yeah.
It got to the point where on Nitro.
Right.
We had the WCW racing segment, and we had this segment, and then that segment, and we had all these promotional considerations to take care of.
What about all the guys we couldn't use at the beginning because they were doing Ready to Rumble?
Yeah.
Remember that?
I mean,
when we first started, there were about 10 to 15 guys we couldn't use.
Yeah.
You know?
Because they were all off doing this, and all of these deals that had been brokered, a year, 2 years prior, that were now coming back to haunt us, and they were affecting the product. They were affecting what we could do because we didn't have the time anymore.
Okay, let's take into account all those reasons that worked against you. Are you proud of what you did during that first 8 to 12 weeks, or do you kind of look at that, like you had said a few minutes ago, we were burned out going in there and we really needed time off. Did that affect your ability to make the best of a bad situation?
I love those first 3
Yeah.
months. I don't care what anybody
Yeah,
says.
okay, that's what I wanted to
As
know.
a wrestling fan,
Yeah.
I would go back right now and watch those first 3 months.
Yeah.
I mean, and
Screaming Norman Smiley.
Norman Smiley and Ernest Miller, and I mean, David
No.
Flair.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
Plus,
sorry. but-
also, I mean, the build up to that NWO. I mean, we keep harping on it, but that was going to be the watershed angle if it had been able to play out the way that we had planned for it. And then the Scott Steiner reveal, we had everybody, convinced that he was because the rumors had been around. He's hurt. He can't work.
Right.
And when we brought him in to
Right.
do that, and he nailed it out of the park.
Yeah.
That tearful, choked up promo, that was in the Astrodome too, I believe.
Yeah, it was.
The entire house was red hot when he finally revealed, it was unbelievable. So it was stuff like that was making it worthwhile. And also not to undersell the stuff we were doing with the guys that were lower on the card, like the Norman Smileys
and I mean, I'm not
Hero
going to
and stuff
lie to you.
like that.
I enjoyed writing those 3 months with
Yeah.
Ed. I enjoyed it. You got to
Yeah.
understand. I knew everything that was going on behind me,
Yeah.
but I wasn't going to deal with it.
But let's
you know.
also talk about, because also at that time there was a lot of pressure on us. There was a lot of pressure on you. And by default there was pressure on me, but not nearly as much. And this was where the two of us started to have our differences. When we were in the WWF, we were in the trenches together. We got thrown together as partners, an ad hoc partnership, but through that we developed a chemistry, a working relationship, and a friendship that you just can't find.
Yeah.
We were incredibly tight because we had each other's back, and that was the bottom line. Nobody else did.
Yeah.
When we went into WCW, I know Vince was feeling a lot of pressure to deliver the numbers and whatnot, but I found myself preaching a little bit more of restraint. And not so much restraint of we can't push it, we can't do that, or we shouldn't do that, or anything like that. It was just a matter of, look, we can do this one of two ways. We can go in, Cowboys, guns blazing, and deal with the political ramifications, which are already amassing on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Amassing, that means gathering.
Yeah, like going to church.
Yeah, something like, because you gather at church. Okay. But we also had, standards and practices to deal with.
Yeah.
And it was like every week we were doing some little something to piss off standards and practices.
And that's something about
And-
standards and practices too that you got to understand. The rules changed every week.
Yeah.
Ed and I said, give us a standards and practices handbook.
Yeah.
Give us a list of what
Let
we
us
can
know
do or
what
can't
we
do.
can
Yeah.
do and what we can do. We asked that for 3 months. The problem was every week the rules changed. So
and it was a distraction. It
right,
didn't necessarily make you realize
it was a speed bump.
What the distraction was we're writing television now, not knowing what we could do and what we couldn't do this week, because they would never give us the guide. They would never show us, okay, here it is.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was very difficult to work around those parameters, you know.
So, and I, having come from Los Angeles and being in the TV industry and sitcoms, I saw this going on, and I was trying to preach to Vince that, you know, we just need to relax a little bit, just a little bit. Take our time. Let's do just a little bit at a time. Yeah, we're not going to change the world overnight, but we never said we were going to. Rome wasn't built in a day, and we knew coming in here it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me, and I can only speak from my perspective on this, that Vince was feeling a lot more of the pressure, and as a result of that, he was making decisions more along the lines of, no, we got to do this now. We got to do this now, and that was where we started to not see eye to eye.
Yeah.
And that was where we had our differences.
And it
that's
affected
where
the
we
friendship.
started. And it definitely affected the friendship, but not greatly until that 3-month mark was up.
Yeah.
And that 3-month mark came up, and they tried to foist the committee on Vince. So Vince was out at that point, and I had a choice to make. And my choice was, I had just moved my wife and my dogs down to Atlanta. I didn't feel like going back to Los Angeles was something that I would want to do, and go back into regular TV writing at all. So I had made a choice, and I was going to stick with it.
And did that hurt that he didn't?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because at that point, I'm not looking at Ed's point of view.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at, you schmuck. I brought you in here with me.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to leave you with Vince, in the waltz by yourself. I brought you in with me. They spit in my face. So of course, I didn't look at, okay, he's got his wife, but of course, and it was it was a real bad time for me. So it's of course I'm not going to look at things logically.
Right.
And at that point, were you guys not even talking, or how bad? Did you keep in touch when you were gone with him, or were you guys weaning time away?
We talked like once or twice, and we talked about this since.
Yeah.
Because it was a matter of, I stayed in there, and for those 3 months afterwards, I was on the committee, and I was the guy who wrote the shows.
Yeah.
I came up with everything that was being done, except for the fact that the way that the rest of the committee worked was they sat around, and this was Kevin Sullivan, Bob Mould was back at the time, who I love Bob. He and I became very close friends. Kevin Nash was on the committee. JJ sat in every now and then. But basically, they would come up with, okay, what are the matches going to be this week?
Yeah.
What are the matches going to be? And then they would give me a list of matches.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
I
makes
would
sense.
go
That
off,
makes sense.
and I would fill in the cracks with the putty and
Yeah.
try and come up with something interesting that wasn't just matches.
That goes right back to the bubble. In
Yeah.
their world,
That's
the
perfectly
matches come
acceptable.
first,
Yeah.
and then the stories follow.
Okay.
In our world, the stories dictate the matches.
Mm-hmm.
That's the flow.
Now, then change comes, and it's you and Eric Bischoff, the dream team who you went to work with Bischoff if he were still in charge when you got hired in the first place, but now you're put together with him. Where explain that and how your feelings on that.
Oh, of course I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to badmouth Eric. I would never badmouth Eric, but at that point, I trusted nobody.
Yeah.
Okay, and Eric did not trust me.
Yeah.
And they should have been smart enough to realize right off the bat we got two guys that don't trust each other.
Yeah.
Right off the
Yeah.
bat.
With different ideas.
With different ideas, and Eric wanted to be
Different
back in the
attitudes.
saddle again, which I completely understood.
Yeah.
And it was such a bad mix. But the reality of it is neither one of us had a choice in the matter.
Yeah.
We got called to go back in and do this thing together.
To get your checks, you did what they said.
So
Now-
you needed me. Yeah.
Now, during this second run, a lot of stuff was done that was criticized. David Arquette being champion as one, and you've defended that a lot. Said mainstream publicity was more important than the integrity of the belt. That may not be a fair way to put your defense, but that's to sum it up in an eggshell. Do you look back now and say, you know what, the belts should have been treated not as a prop, the infamous words that get thrown back at you a lot, but should have been protected more so that the belt meant something, because that belt changed hands, and all your belts changed hands so fast that title changes meant nothing anymore.
Well, again, it's look at how David Arquette won the belt.
Oh, it was a fluke, but nevertheless.
Okay, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Anybody who is a non-wrestling fan, see, that's the problem.
Yeah.
You're always going to have your core of wrestling fans. As long as wrestling is in the title, they're going to watch the show.
But they were watching Raw.
Okay, but
I mean, in that instance, they
right.
had an alternative. That was the tough part.
Right, but exactly. But, you know, the whole success of the WWF was bringing in those fans that weren't wrestling fans, bringing them in from the outside and you know, and bringing them to your product. And basically, with the David Arquette thing, I mean, that's all we were trying to do was to get the publicity, and we did. We got a lot of publicity.
You still feel strongly that was the right decision?
Absolutely. I'd make that same decision tomorrow. I would fight that to my grave.
How about you becoming world champion? In similar situation, you in the interview I did with you when you got hired by WCW said, "My ego's not involved. I don't want to be on TV."
Right.
What went through your mind when you said fans want to see Vince Russo as a world champion? That'd be a good thing to do.
But that's the thing again. It wasn't like that.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to look at the circumstances. Yeah. First of all, again, it goes right back to with Vince McMahon and throwing out the wrestling rule book. And it goes back to the reality, and anything can happen on any given night. You've got to tune in.
But why you?
Well, but because it was the circumstances of the match. If you remember, I was in a cage match with Booker T.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the whole deal.
Yeah.
As Booker T is ready to walk out the cage, in comes Goldberg, who spears me through the cage before Booker T can walk out.
Yeah.
That's entertainment.
But why you? Why you in that position? You're the writer, and you know that downfall. A lot of in the history of wrestling is people who write their own show putting themselves in the middle of it, not only because maybe you lose perspective on what's working, what isn't, but you also lose the confidence of the performers because they think you're putting you in front of them.
Well, let me just say one thing and then you can. But I hear you, but the bottom line was after that happened, the very next night I gave the title back.
Right.
I mean, it's not like Vince Russo had this run. It was just done for entertainment's sake and entertainment value. You know, it goes back to you got 4 hours of TV a week. You've got to try to do something different.
One thing I'll say to back up what Vince was saying, but a different tack on it, was the fact that at the time in the storyline, he was the, essentially the one of the top heels, presences.
Yes.
So in order to, get over that heel character, draw some heat from the fans, then to me it made more sense to have that happen for him for that reason, because he was part of the storylines. Now, one thing I will say, and we've talked about this before, I understand his perspective of the David Arquette putting the title on him, and also this was at the point when we weren't working together.
Yeah.
But I feel that logic would be 100% sound if it was an Arnold Schwarzenegger, if it was a star who was up here, not the 1-800-CALL-ATT guy. You know what I mean? And I think that's where a lot of the problems come from. If we're going to put the belt on a non-wrestler, make it somebody at least that will make more of a splash, as opposed to a fluke kind of B-level celebrity.
No one but.
And I think that's where the insult was added to injury.
Okay, another criticism, Vince, especially in the second run, is inconsistency. You had wrestlers on the air, you had announcers on the air talking about how finishes were planned, and someone broke from script. When you say that on the air, the mentality of the viewer is, well, I don't know if I can take anything seriously. That comes up later when I'm supposed to believe there's a real fight going on and suspend my disbelief and get into it, because they're telling me some stuff is scripted and some isn't. The fans you were appealing to, who would know and be able to make sense of that, were the ones who knew better and knew nobody was breaking from script. Even the stuff that was scripted to sound like it wasn't in script actually was part of the script. You couldn't recreate that Bret Hart feeling of spontaneity anymore, because the fans who you were appealing to, critics point to this era and say, knew everything was scripted. So just put on a show and entertain us. Don't try to trick us, or don't change beats. Does that make sense in retrospect, that people were seeing it that way and that's something you're criticized for?
Again, when you talk about criticism, okay, which I can accept, I used to have a much more problem with it than I do now. But when you talk about criticism, okay, you're talking about the criticism from the pure 100% by the dirt sheets, wrestling fans.
Who are looking at the ratings and the buy rates
Right.
and attendance crashing, and they want to see the business protected,
Okay.
and they thought you were hurting something they love
Well,
by approaching it the way you were.
And I understand
And
that.
so do you understand the
I
criticism?
do understand that, but you know, it all goes back to those fans are going to be there forever. I was going to go back at the WWE. It was about, I guess, a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
I'll never forget it. When I went there, the rating was a 3.7. What was the rating last Monday night? 3.8?
Yeah, roughly.
Okay, so a year
Yeah.
and a half, that's not changed.
Yep.
That is your core audience that is going to watch wrestling as long as wrestling was in the title.
And decent.
Yeah.
I mean, WWE's done a decent enough job.
Right. Well, you know, again, it all goes back to the same formula that worked at the WWF to bring that whole other crowd that laugh at. I have a 14-year-old son
Yeah.
that thinks wrestling is a joke. I know 12-year-old kids that think wrestling is a joke.
Yeah.
The only way you're going to get that back is to throw some sense of reality into the mix, where maybe it's even a deal where they don't quite know what's going on, but I want to tune in next week to try to figure this thing out. That's what happened with the Vince interview with Brett.
Yeah.
A lot of people, they even Ed, you knew something was wrong here, you knew something was different, but you weren't quite sure of what it was. That made you tune in the following week, because here's the bottom line. Unless new things are tried, or unless things like this are experimented with, your rating's going to be a 3.5 for the next 20 years.
So you're thinking to yourself, we got nothing to lose, and I'm just going to try things. But was it also a point where it was almost a burnout stage where things were just coming so fast? Or are you proud of that work?
No,
I mean,
I got to be honest with you, and I'm being totally honest with you. You know, Ed and I did it for the first 3 months.
Yeah.
You talked about the difference in the ratings.
Yeah.
Well, by the time I came back 3 months later, it was right back to where Ed and I had started.
The goods were damaged again.
I knew,
Yeah.
I'm telling you, as sure as I'm sitting here, I knew at that point there was no way we were going to be able to overcome that again.
Yeah.
Because here were Ed and I, 3 months we were on the road. 3 months they tore that road down. There was no way we were going to be able to build it again and bring those fans back again. And I
and so
knew
you're
that.
searching for the next concept.
Absolutely,
That means shock. Change.
absolutely something, because I knew we wouldn't be able to get those fans back again because we just screwed with them so many times.
Yeah. Through all of this, you guys entered, got to know each other, got to be very good friends. Like, the term marriage was used. I mean, it was a marriage of work. And you guys were partners, and your strength was your weakness was his strength. You built on it. But then there were hard feelings when push came to shove after that first hard decision came in WCW. What's happened since then? Because from being around you guys, it looks like the good times are more important than the bad right now, and you guys have found a way to come back together and not let the wrestling business destroy a friendship that it actually helped create.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from the point where Vince left WCW the first time was ousted, you know, we didn't talk that much, we didn't speak that much, and even when he came back in, we were separate. The first time we had a conversation, like a real honest to goodness conversation, I think was when Vince. I was working with TNA when they first started up, and I was doing post-production for them, supervising post-production. I was also the color commentator on the air. Vince got hired, brought in to work with the company. And the first day he came to the offices in Nashville, the two of us sat down because it had been so long, and we had been so close together, and we just basically got everything out on the table between the two of us. And I kind of understood where Vince was coming from. Vince was, during those bad times, he was very vulnerable. He was very alone. You know, he had nobody. He didn't feel like he had anybody watching his back. He didn't feel like he had anybody he could depend on. And I was one of those people that he felt like he couldn't depend on based on my decision. And I understood that. But something had occurred to me, because I didn't feel like I was a bad person for doing what I did. But then I realized, and when I was speaking with Vince, I brought it up, and I just basically said, you know, through all those bad times, I know he was having bad times. And jump in here whenever you want. I said, because I had hard feelings too, and I was wondering why. And it came clear to me that one of the reasons why I had hard times was because he had to know, or I felt he did, how miserable I was, the situation I was in, because I stuck around and I was trying to patch the holes, and I was just doing everything that I could do, to try and keep the company afloat. And throughout that whole time, he never asked me, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And then
you both were in a situation, a
were-
pressure cooker,
we were
where you were
so-
thinking about yourselves, and you weren't able to empathize with each other.
Well, it's also, again, you've got to keep in mind, I moved my entire family, and I have 3 kids, to Atlanta.
Yeah.
2 kids, especially one who was a teenager. It was a very, very difficult move. I'm in Atlanta for a month, and the writing's on the wall. So, the first thing I'm thinking about is my family. I mean, I dragged them here. Now what? So I didn't even consider what I was feeling. I at that point in time, I couldn't consider what I was feeling. But I was home, and I was alone, and I was going through a very difficult time. And then even the TNA experience, and what I found, trying to take myself out of the situation, was I was becoming more and more and more everything I despised about the wrestling business. I was becoming. And the reason why I was becoming that way was because in order to survive in it, you've got to change. The wrestling business changes you. You become paranoid. You begin throwing up your defense mechanisms. You're not the same person you were. And when I finally just stopped myself, and I mean it really wasn't me. This is it's a long story, but I had a revelation. I mean, I really had a revelation from God, and what happened was I could see clearly that I didn't like the person I had become. Because what the wrestling business did was it changed my heart. It turned me into a person that I wasn't. And the bottom line is, at the core of the real me, I loved Ed. I mean, I truly loved Ed. Everything that happened between us was the wrestling business. It had nothing to do with my genuine feelings for Ed, but all of a sudden, a guy I loved, I no longer trusted. I thought was stabbing me in the back. I thought, I thought all these horrible things about Ed. And then what happened was, when I went to TNA, the same thing happened with Jeff. Same thing happened with my friend Jeff Jarrett, where, all of a sudden, my heart was literally becoming black, where I was looking at an Ed, or I was looking at a Jeff, and I was seeing the bad side of everything, because that's what the business had done to me. There was no more good side. It was all black. It was bad people. It was paranoia. It was drugs. It was alcohol. It was a lot of things. And, like I said, finally when I had the revelation and I got shook to the rafters, and the message was loud and clear, look at what you've become. And when I was able to look at what I've become, and what the wrestling business, after 13, 14 years, turned me into, I was at the point now where I could not look at myself in the mirror. I wasn't that guy. And, that's when I knew, and that's when I came to the realization, you need to get out of this thing.
Do you hate the wrestling business now? And do you think that you could have gone through that experience differently and not ended up with a black heart?
I hate the wrestling business.
Yeah.
I hate everything the wrestling business represents. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. The wrestling business almost ruined my life. And again, if it wasn't for that revelation, and if it wasn't for God coming to the rescue when I was at rock bottom, I don't know what I would have done, because I went through many bouts of depression, many bouts of, anxiety. I went through many difficult
and concussions,
times.
Physical.
And it was because of the environment that I was in.
Do you think you were especially vulnerable, and other people might not have been as vulnerable and ended up in the same dark place you did?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Do you think the wrestling business would have affected everybody in your position the same way?
Not.
There's something about you that made it
because
unique.
I'll say this once and I'll say it again, and this is the reason Ed and I were sitting here. And I've said this a million times. You cannot be a good guy and exist in the wrestling business.
And remain a good guy.
And remain a good guy. Yeah, you either have to change, or get out, but you can't be a good guy and be in the wrestling business. It's not cut out for
Does
people
that
like
make you think a little differently than your answer earlier about Triple H? You've been away from him for a few years. Now he's been in the business a long time. Do you think that's possible? I mean, I know you can't speak to him specifically, but
I know Triple H went through exactly what I went through, and Triple H was put in a position where he came in the nice guy like me, innocent with all the right intentions, and the business forces you to change. I heard a story just the other day of Triple H walking into a hotel, 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 kids were there to get an autograph. He wouldn't give either one of them an autograph at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's not the Hunter I know.
Yeah.
So that tells me the same thing is happening to him that happened to me. The only difference is, I got a wake-up call from God.
Yeah.
And I had to look myself in the mirror, and I had to say, look at what you've become. And I had to make that change.
And do you agree with those thoughts, or do you think it's a different people will experience it differently?
I think that I agree with the fact that you've got to either get out or change if you're a good person.
Yeah.
I don't hate the wrestling business the way that Vince does. I know it's not for me, and I don't like to see what it's done to a lot of very good people.
Is it inherent in the wrestling business, or is it inherent in the people who happen to run the wrestling business?
What's the difference?
But it is
There could be in a parallel
Right,
universe.
right.
Could professional wrestling as an entertainment form exist and not hurt people like you and make you?
I think it could, but I mean, you'd have to literally start from square one, and you would have to reinvent
So the
infrastructure of the
certain
entire
people
business.
with control are in control of whether it's a dark world to be part of.
I think it's,
or is it the
it's
nature
a
of the
fact,
beast and
it's
unavoidable?
it's an entire subculture.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like when you have, I know, you've got 2 friends that individually they're great people and you get along really well. Like they're a couple, a man and a woman. Individually they're great people, really good people. You bring them together, and for some reason there's some sort of chemical reaction that causes them to bring out the worst in each other.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is what the wrestling industry does with all these people together. It just brings out the worst.
It just might be the baggage that's carried from where it came
From one to another,
where it came
and
from,
a
and
place
how
where
people
it can
succeeded.
flourish.
How people succeeded historically is how people are going to try to succeed in the future, and that pattern is one that is going to destroy good.
I mean, and I feel badly because, like Vince, it's the business has brought me so much pleasure over the course of my life, being a fan all the time as a kid, looking at it through those eyes of innocence. Having been in it, not so much.
Yes or no? Would you do it all over again?
No.
Would you do it all over again?
I don't know.